Hello, everyone. Welcome to Collaborative Conversations on Building a Culture of Writing, a series designed to build teachers' capacity for writing instruction. Before we start the live conversation, we invite you to start and continue the conversation on Twitter. Use hashtag Culture of Writing to start the conversation. Today is the second 6 through 12 session entitled Essential Components of Writing. In this session, participants will become familiar with instructional frameworks for teaching writing. They will also deepen their understanding of ways to integrate writing opportunities in response to students' engagement with text. So without further delay, let's build a culture of writing as Dr. Kevin Rachinsky and Ashley Morris share best practices for assessing writing.
Good morning to you all. It's great to see you again. I'm Kevin Rachinsky, and this is, of course, Ashley Morris. We're back in action again. We had a great webinar back in September, and we're going to build on what we talked about in September here now on October 20th. We're going into session 2 now, where we'll talk about the essential components of teaching writing, and really looking forward to this webinar. Thank you for making time out of your day to attend. I think it's going to be a good use of everybody's time. If you haven't been on the webinar with us before, or our September session, we'll just say a little bit about ourselves, and then we're just going to get started right away. So I'm Kevin Rachinsky. I've had a chance to talk with a lot of you over the years, and like I said back in September, if I haven't had a chance to collaborate with you historically, I really hope that I have the chance to do it in the future. It's been great forming a lot of relationships with educators across the state. It's been a real passion and a real joy in my career. A little bit about my teaching from 2003 to 2005. I taught first-year composition at the University of Georgia. That was a really fantastic experience. I have a pretty good understanding of where kids need to be in terms of their writing achievement by the time they enter the college ranks. 2005, I made a transition to the Georgia Center for Assessment, where I'm currently the assistant director. From then, 2005 until the present, I've had a great privilege of working with students across the state in grades K all the way through grade 12. A lot of focus on text-dependent writing, the kind of writing that students would find on, well, in a lot of contexts. In your class, they would find it on a variety of summative assessments. So text-dependent writing would be a kind of writing that students see a lot of in the college ranks and the career ranks as well. So again, pleasure to be with you. Looking forward to talking with you throughout this webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, who will say a few words about herself.
Good morning. I'm Ashley Morris. I'm currently the secondary ELA professional learning specialist in Cobb County School District. My teaching experience includes 8th grade reading, 5th grade writing. I spent some time in Maryland where I taught some exceptional 5th graders, and then I moved here to Georgia in 2010, where I was a middle school English language arts teacher, 7th grade at the time. I became an academic coach at that same school, where I supported about 65 very enthusiastic teachers for 3 years as their instructional coach. And as I mentioned, I am currently working with phenomenal secondary teachers in Cobb County School District as a professional learning specialist. Absolutely love supporting teachers, building teachers, inspiring teachers, which of course translates to the students that we serve. You'll notice there that my passion statement is just for you to simply provide meaningful and personalized experiences for your students. I think we'll capture a lot of that and reference many factors that support that passion statement throughout our session today. Very excited to be here with you again. It was very nice to hear from several of you after our first session, and I look forward to future collaborations with you.
Just circling back a little bit to what we covered in session 1, we started with a focus on assessing writing, really for one key reason, because in that discussion we found out in 2 of the genres, argumentative writing as well as narrative writing, some of the very specific elements that would be particular to those 2 genres. So for instance, in argumentative writing we have elements or vocabulary such as claim, reason, evidence, elaboration, sometimes called analysis, depending on the context. At grade 7 and higher, students are going to need to address counterclaims. So those elements or those vocabulary terms associated with argumentative writing are pieces that we really talked a whole lot about, and I think that's really going to pave the way for instructional moments that we're going to be talking a lot about today. So instructionally we can model these elements and really engage our students in really owning these elements, really owning these pieces of vocabulary that would be specific to these two genres, which I think really promotes self-regulation. So students really realizing that anytime I sit down to write an argument, I'm really going to aim for a clear claim, that if I'm writing a longer argument, I'm going to have relevant reasons that I'm using to support my claim, so on and so forth. And really the same would be true for narrative writing. So when we think about good fiction writing, or we think about good narrative writing, we could think about rich description, using lots of specific detail about setting, about character, so on and so forth. We could think about the element of dialogue. Really good fiction, occasionally when it makes sense, includes really good dialogue. So we're really going to be talking about modeling these elements as we talk today in our second webinar. So more concretely, here would be the objectives for this morning. And actually, I'm going to ask Ashley if you'd be comfortable taking us away on this slide.
Absolutely. So as Kevin mentioned, we're going to focus now on the essential teaching components. We started with assessment, so now we're going to dig into what does that mean in our classroom? What does that look like in terms of teaching? So we're going to open with the instructional framework, have some conversations about time for writing, how we open our lessons, what the work session might look like for students, and how we close. We're going to reference some very specific writing norms and behaviors, and we're going to want to hear back from you when we get to that part to kind of collaborate and hear what you're doing to establish writing norms in your classroom. We're going to talk about modeling, and then we'll move into the writer's process. And what we're thinking is, as we go through this webinar, we're going to start with kind of some of those very short, abbreviated writing opportunities for students, and then move into the more extended writing situations and implications associated with that. It's broken up with argumentative and narrative writing in mind, but a couple of the topics are going to kind of be merged together since they're applicable to both genres of writing. Do you want to add to that, Kevin?
No, I think that sounds great. Yep.
All right, so as you might remember from our first session together, we've got some collaborative conversation signals that are going to pop up throughout the webinar, and at that time we're going to ask you to pose questions, share any comments that you may have. You might have made some connections. You have the opportunity through the webinar, if you're on with us live, to put those responses into the little chat window. If you want to join us on Twitter, we'll have our phones out during this webinar, and so we'll be following that hashtag culture of writing as well. So you're welcome to choose either of those options for our collaborative conversation signals. All right, so let's jump right in. Thinking about the instructional framework and how that impacts writing time and how we plan for writing. Take a moment and look at this, this visual here. And this is the instructional framework, just a suggestion that's provided to us from the Department of Ed, from the school and district, the Division of School and District Effectiveness. Outstanding document for us to reference as secondary ELA and English teachers when we're thinking about planning for writing instruction. As you can see to the right, we want to focus our attention there and kind of think about this as we go throughout the session, how the instructional framework is broken up. Our goal as secondary teachers, of course, is to execute the instructional framework on a daily basis, and one way that we can do that is to ensure that we're actually planning for that for our students. Looking a little closer, you'll notice there's a little legend there for you at the bottom. That gold area represents the opening. Blue, the transition from your opening to your work session. Green being the work session. And then the red part being your closing. And what I love about this visual is that they make it very clear for us here, which I love this, thinking about teacher autonomy, student needs, that this is going to vary based on our instructional focus, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about that. There's no set time, no right or wrong to this, but I think for me this visual reminds us that we do need to have a very sound instructional framework when we're considering planning for and executing our students executing writing instruction. Did you want to add anything to that, Kevin?
No, and I think this is like Ashley said, I think this is a really nice document. So yeah. Perfect.
So looking a little closer, we've got some arrows here. We have some essential components that we're going to talk about for each of the sections on this instructional framework. So let's start with the opening. Thinking about your classroom, and you may have some thoughts about this, and we're going to have some time to collaborate and kind of hear what you're thinking. But that opening is going to be very standards focused, element focused. This is where we're introducing this to students, maybe reminding them of what our learning targets are for the day. A lot of modeling is going to happen at this part of our work time. Student practice or conversation might also take place in the opening. more of that guided practice. Maybe there's a skill that you've modeled for students, and now you're giving them the opportunity to try that skill on their own as writers. Most of that is going to happen in the opening. Then we've got the transition, so that in-between time between the opening and the work session, right before you set the students loose. I love this component of the instructional framework. It's honestly not something that I've never used the language, the transition time, but I love that because it's very intentional. It's setting the students up for what they're going to do when you set them loose. So a couple things that might happen during that transition time is organizing and learning tools. Maybe there are graphic organizers that you introduce to your students that are going to support them during their writing time. Rubrics, which we referenced in our first session, just how critical rubrics are, whether they be teacher created or student created. Maybe they're a writer's checklist that students are going to quickly skim over and maybe set some goals around before they're set loose. And of course, writing journals and portfolios, which kind of connect writing for students, right? Having some system in place, somewhere where students can collect their writing is so critical when it comes to establishing a culture of writing in a classroom. You might even be setting up some conference goals and expectations in that transition time. After all that's been done, you're definitely ready for a very student-led, intentional work session. This is a time where teachers are facilitating writing conferences, possibly those desk-side conferences. We are in a secondary setting, so we know that looks a little different for us in secondary, but definitely providing and planning for some opportunities for small group conferencing or even one-on-one. The conferencing really allows us during the work session to provide very specific feedback for our students, which is so important when we're thinking of students having the time to write and then receiving feedback, whether it be from the teacher or from their peers. The work session is also a fabulous time for students to apply what they've discovered during that opening session. Remember, if you've modeled a new strategy or a new concept that's closely tied to their writing, this is their time to now explore that and experience that. If you do have a time to look back at that document closer, they reference in the work session that students should be participating in productive struggle. I love that phrase because it really connotes that students are learning and they're discovering on their own. It's about the students doing the work and the students engaging in productive struggle. So definitely something to think about when you're planning for your work session. And then we're prepared for our closing. Celebrations can happen at this time. A recap of what has been the progress that was made during the work session can take place. This may happen as a whole group, maybe smaller groups. Author's chair, phenomenal concept that yes, secondary students do love too. You know, that's something that they're introduced to in the elementary setting. But oh my goodness, to get middle schoolers and high schoolers celebrating their work as authors and maybe having a very special designated spot in our classrooms for them to showcase what they've done is something that can definitely happen in the closing as well. Closing is a great time for students to identify next steps, you know, connecting their learning. Where will I pick up tomorrow? And then, of course, a time for us as the teachers, the facilitators, to kind of listen and to begin to collect some informal data on what do my next steps need to be. A couple points we wanted to make about the instructional framework is that opening and closing are essential. You know, oftentimes we're asked, you know, hey, my students are just doing an extended writing, so they can just come in and get started. We really want to be very intentional day to day that we open our classroom, our lessons, and that we close as well. So it might be a lot shorter if students are working on a more extended task, but still having something that sets the stage for the day and then closes or recaps the learning for the day as well. Do you want to add anything to that, Kevin?
I love the explanation of that slide, and I can't agree more with what Ashley said about the opening and the closing being really nice bookend pieces for this pie chart, if you will. You take the different proportions of time. And one thing I would just add, in the opening, we can be really specific, and I think that being really specific as instructors, giving our students a really clear sense of what we're going to be covering with regards to that reading-writing connection in a particular class period. I think everybody on this webinar is a million steps ahead of me on this, but the more specific direction, the better. And it really paves the way for a more successful period for that work session where students are actually engaging in that kind of productive struggle. And I do want to really emphasize what Ashley said about author's chair. I mean, even if you teach high school, I mean, having students come up and share out some of the things that they have really accomplished. I mean, we know from, and we'll talk about some of the research findings a little bit later, but I mean, one of the things that we can really point to is students really having, if they haven't clear opportunities to learn from one another, we become better writers together. And so there again, I mean, back to specificity, if we've got students coming up to share out some specific pieces of writing that they've created, or it may not even be a piece of writing, it may simply be a plan that you've come up with that people can look at together, that the classroom can look at together. That can be very valuable time. So I just wanted to piggyback on that point. It's a really good point.
Great. So before we move on, we've started with the instructional framework. We wanted to be very intentional about that because clearly, you know, looking at all of the different student moves that will happen during each of these components on the instructional framework, it's truly an essential in terms of building a culture of writing in your class. And we are going to go a little bit deeper into the opening and talk about the mini lesson. But we wanted to start here just to reiterate the level of accountability that planning with and considering the instructional framework provides for us as we're planning for writing instruction. So, how often do your students write? Thinking about the instructional framework, the various components involved, and you know, if you're thinking about your lesson plans or your writing lessons, it might not look just like this, right? You might use language that's a little different, and that's okay. But just kind of think about time-wise. How often do your students write? We're going to give you a moment to think about that, have some conversations with the people around you. If you're on this webinar with your PLC, you're welcome to tweet out your thinking using that hashtag culture of writing. We'll check that here in just a moment. Tell us what you're thinking. How often do your students write?
And if I could actually throw on another question, would be not only how often do your students write, but what kind of writing are they really engaged in? So if you take on that second question, that would be great, and we can't wait to hear from you. Cassandra just sent a nice little nudge to everyone. This is an opportunity for everybody to share, so please dive in.
We do have a question. Someone is asking, Aaron is asking about bell ringers and about the content, what the content should or shouldn't be, and the amount of time, and whether it should be considered part of the opener.
Absolutely. So when I hear bell ringers, and I think that's just a different use in language, right? I would use the word opener or your do now. We've heard many different things. A bell ringer is definitely appropriate for the opening. That's kind of your way of getting your students in and situated and settled. I think that bell ringers can vary based on what the lesson or what you're going to be modeling for the day, Aaron. I think the key with those do nows and warm-ups or whatever we choose to call them is that they are connected directly to what the students will be exploring during the work session, right? So that they're not just these very random, you know, ideas or questions that don't really mean anything for our students. So maybe just bell ringers that are very connected to the work that they're going to experience for that work session. What are your thoughts?
I totally agree, and the more specific, the better. The greater connectivity to the broader work, to the broader cycle, if you will, the better. And if you're wondering about us getting a little bit more specific with some concrete examples of what you saw in that pie chart a little bit earlier, we're moving in that direction. But
yes,
we wanted to really share that framework first because I think it's a really nice graphic.
Mm-hmm. Aaron, that's a great question.
Great question.
I also feel that bell ringers and warm-ups are great. They sometimes provide us as facilitators with great data.
Yep.
Just quick, you know, kind of where are my students, what are they thinking? So awesome question. Thank you for that. Let's see if we have any tweets here. right, so we're going to move on. But if you're going to go back to this, if you're not on the live webinar and you're seeing this question, we definitely feel like this is a very strong question to pose within your PLCs whenever you have the opportunity. You know, just a quick check-in. How often are my students writing? And as Kevin said, what are they writing about? So definitely refer back to this question.
I can't agree more with that. I mean, just talking with colleagues about this seems like a very basic question, but a great one to ask of one another, colleagues in the building. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about norms and behaviors that support us with building a culture of writing in our classroom. And we're just going to quickly go through this list. And as we are doing that, you may, have some thoughts or comments comments about some of these norms. Feel free to type those into the chat box, if you will. So strategies, and we're going to talk very specifically about strategies and how they apply to the mini lesson in just a moment. But we put this here first for a couple of reasons. We understand, we think about the Georgia Standards of Excellence and the demands of writing that our students experience in the secondary setting. And students that struggle and students who are proficient writers, they need to have a variety of strategies in their toolbox, right? So that when they encounter, those higher level questions or text dependent questions or even authentic prompts, that they have tools that they can rely on to support them. And one way that we can do that is to provide them with strategies and model those strategies. Teaching thematically, we realize, especially in our high school settings, that we have many classics that we love, and so really connecting those classics to current things that are happening around the world that can connect to the students who fill the seats of our classrooms today is key. Writers' notebooks and portfolios, you may choose to call them something else, but some type of artifact for our students, something that they can tangibly touch, hold, that it's a collection of their writing, and that reminds them that there is a culture of writing in this classroom, and we write often. Conferencing systems, which support us with providing feedback, using relevant text to inspire writing. And we talked a lot about that in our first session, and we will in the second half of this session too. Really pulling those texts that grab our students' attention and truly inspire them to write. Exemplars, whether they be student exemplars or teacher exemplars, peer collaboration, providing the time for authentic writing. You can see there, writers need time to write. When we think of ourselves as adult learners, we need time to really develop and to become proficient in particular areas. So considering the time that you're providing for your students is key. Timed writing with reflection. There was a time, and I was guilty of this my first couple of years of teaching, where we did a lot of timed writing, but we didn't really reflect. Like it's timed, and this is why, because I need to build your writing stamina. But we recognize now that we need that extra piece of reflection. Yes, we can have some time writing experiences, but we also need to offer students the time to let's reflect on how that went. Have you set goals? Have some conversations with your peers? Are you growing as a writer? Like, what does that mean? How did this time writing feel different from the first time that we experienced it? And then hot topics, which we know in the secondary setting really allow us to build rapport with our students, engage them, and typically those hot topics lean more towards that argumentative side, get our students heated with establishing claims and recognizing counterclaims. So just a few norms here, rather, that we believe strongly will support our secondary classrooms with really building a culture of writing and sustaining that culture. Do you want to add to that?
That second to the last bullet, like timed writing with reflection, if your students are like many of the students with whom I've worked, it can be that's one of those norms in my own career where I have felt that that's not an overnight thing, but it's an over time thing. So it's been hard for me to kind of be patient from time to time, but some hard-earned reflections when it comes to a lot of students that I've worked with, when they feel like, all right, I've written a short argument or a longer argument. After I've written it, I'm done, right? But some of the best writing is rewriting, right? And that can be a rhythm that some students don't really. It's not their default necessarily, and I think that that's where our community comes in. Like one of those norms being that some of the best writing that we do is rewriting. So when we think about reflection, even on timed writing, like what went well, what would I have changed up? I mean, that's a really nice thing to implement into our broader culture. So I just wanted, I love that second. I love all these bullets, but that second to the last one really stuck out at me.
Yes, and one thing we want to reiterate about the norms is that when we think of the word norm and how it's defined, it's typical, it's a standard, right? It's the usual process that happens in our classroom. So the point here is we know we first have to establish norms and we have to commit to them. And you may not commit to or want to commit to all, and I mean just everything that's here. This is overwhelming. This could be a lot, right? But the key is that we do have some norms established in our classroom, so that students are aware that this is a norm. Like, this is what we do to build ourselves as writers. This is a norm that Ms. Morris has put in place because of being very purposeful and really just committing to them so that they become norms and remain norms.
Absolutely. And if I could just say, I think what correlates with that quite nicely is that last bullet. Not even just necessarily hot topics, but us as practitioners thinking very intentionally about topics that our students really want to write about and that they would see meaning in. I think that in my own career, and Ashley, I bet you've seen this yourself, and everybody on the webinar, I'm sure that you've seen this, that when the activities, the literacy activities that we're bringing in front of students really matter to them,
right,
it's so much easier to build that buy-in with regard to the norms, right? So, like, for instance, I think it's going to be way, way more likely for students to not necessarily automatically, but more naturally gravitate toward reflecting on what they've done if the topic really matters to them. So I think some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today are topics that really do matter to students, and so I just that's one thing that really stuck out in terms of really fostering those norms. It can also correlate with the topics that we engage our students in. This is something that I would love, and I know that Ashley and I, we talked about this slide before we got here this morning. Everybody's got norms. I mean, so this is a really cool opportunity to either share with us via Twitter or share with us via the webinar. Some of the writing norms that you've established in your classroom, the examples that we just saw on slide 11 are certainly, we don't have the market sewed up there. We don't have the market cornered. So this is a great opportunity for you as practitioners to share with one another and with us some of the writing norms that you've established in your classroom. So not that the first question that we asked you wasn't a good one, but I would love to hear what you all have to say on this one. So we'll take a few minutes, and if you would, tweet out, or if you would, using the hashtag Culture of Writing, but also you can use the webinar chat feature with regard to what are some norms that you've established in your classroom.
And while we're waiting, we had a response on Twitter from Regina Gladney from Douglas County. She mentioned from that first question that your students write daily. It might be a quick write or an extended response.
Great answer. Great answer. Yeah, this is a daily practice. Yeah, and the thing is, it doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out assignment, right?
Absolutely not. Nope, love it.
Come on, I know some of you personally who are on this webinar, and I know that you've got great things to say. Yeah, great things to say, so please contribute. This is a community, so we'd love to hear your ideas. Give a few more minutes.
All right, so we'll move forward. Again, another great question or phrase, if you will, to reflect on within your PLCs when you're having conversations and planning for writing instruction. All right, so let's go into the mini lesson a little bit, have some conversations about how the mini lesson plus modeling supports a culture of writing and really sustains that. When you think back to that visual that we opened with, the instructional framework, we have that opening section that is very important for us to not only to commit to every day, but to understand like what that looks like. A very essential part of the opening is a mini lesson. When we think about writing instruction and introducing students to various strategies to meet the demands of the standards, whether it be inserting effective dialogue or using transitions to move your story along, or counterclaims to recognize the opposing views of others, we sometimes need to plan for very intentional mini lessons to model for students what this looks like. This is just a little snapshot of a couple of elements that make a good mini lesson that I definitely agree with as a previous teacher for middle school students, and now a teacher who's inspiring other teachers. This comes from a group called Teaching That Makes Sense. And so just take a moment to look at this. We're not going to read this to you, but a couple essential components within the mini lesson that we feel are pretty effective. So brevity, considering the length of our mini lesson. Focus, being very specific. And the focus, to me, this is key when we're thinking about planning and what it is that we need our students to do. I also connect the focus to data. Like, what is a data set that my students still need, right? So thinking back to session 1, we talked about assessing writing, being very intentional. The mini lesson is a great place to use that data to build and support our students as writer. And then authenticity, considering and reminding the students the purpose of them as good writers, like building them as writers. So this is what good writers do.
Right.
In a narrative piece, they're going to insert dialogue, or they're going to move, develop their characters in various ways. So being very clear with your students as well, and this and that component is very important. Do you want to add that before we?
Just that piece on specificity that you mentioned. The more concrete, the better. And so just wanted to highlight that on slide 13. That's that focus piece. Brevity, focus, authenticity, absolutely.
And before we move on, brevity is something, as I'm supporting teachers, more and more teachers, and we're wrapping our minds around and becoming better at the mini lesson, there's always that question of how long should it be?
Right.
And the reality is there's who has the answer for that, right? Like, we don't. What we do recognize is that it's called a mini lesson for a reason, right? So you can decide and make that decision, again, based on your students. You know the skill, you know what you're introducing them, the standard or the element, or where they need to grow. But, considering that it should be short, it should not be the entire class period. We do know that, right? But you can make that decision as a teacher. How long does this need to be? Also, remembering that you have that beautiful work session, that independent time that is going to follow that mini lesson. So don't have the answer for that, but definitely wanted to mention that because that is a question that I know many teachers probably have.
Sure. This is one of the argumentative topics that was it's more of an essay topic that the Department of Education has released from the 9th grade literature and composition item and scoring sampler. This is an essay question, so this would be building toward a longer argumentative assignment. So as a teacher, I can keep this in mind and really scaffold students towards success on a longer argumentative assignment like this by first engaging students in really shorter activities that are honing in on some of those specific elements of argumentation that we talked about in the last webinar. But I just wanted to point this one out. Ashley's got some really great instructional techniques that relate to just shorter in nature. That are just like shorter activities that really are designed to build up toward the longer essay. So just wanted to point that out as we look at this slide. This is just kind of me as a teacher keeping the long view in mind, keeping in mind, let's say this is an essay topic that I want to introduce my students to at some point in the near future. I can design a series of shorter argumentative activities that are really going to scaffold students towards success on this longer essay. So this is not the activity that I'd be working on with students at this point. This is just me having this in the back of my mind as I scaffold students toward that longer argumentative piece.
Absolutely. So what Kevin is showing us is where we need to put our focus, right? When I'm thinking about a mini lesson,
yep.
Thinking about focusing and what I know I'm going to eventually want my students to be able to do, so claims, counterclaims,
Yep.
all those great argumentative techniques. My mini lessons are now going to be very focused on that because I have that in the back of my mind.
There you go.
So I'm glad that was there. So thinking about that kind of extended prompt and teaching thematically, we talked about that being one of our norms to building a culture of writing. We've landed on the theme of how technology impacts our health. So let's just kind of walk through an example of how we would approach this in terms of essential teaching components and the different processes and things that would be happening during this, unit or theme. A variety of texts that would be connected to this theme. Teaching thematically and considering multiple texts is going to allow us to address various informational standards. You might have a literary text that's extended in nature that might even support the theme of this as well. All of this is going to support us with developing argumentative writing elements in our students, okay? So we have an example here, Georgia Standards of Excellence, 7th grade writing, and we've got the arrow specifically there to element B, okay? So thinking about data, I'm a teacher and I know that my students have a need here. They need support with developing their claims, logical reason, identifying that when they're reading, but also using that as writers.
That's right.
Okay? Wanted to provide a secondary example as well. So here's the same standard, same thing for 11th and 12th grade. Okay, we're just establishing some background here. I'm a teacher, I'm preparing, I know I need to be thinking of some mini lessons to develop my students, same element, same standard for writing, okay? So what I might do, because I'm teaching thematically, I want a variety of text, I'm going to start building mini lessons, and I need to model some very intentional strategies for my students. So looking on that left-hand side, this is just a reminder of the instructional framework, right? Because I'm planning with this in mind. In my opening, I have a great opportunity to model strategies for my students. I'm going to use the what happened, what this makes me think strategy. This is a great strategy. I've tweaked it a little bit so it's a little more secondary friendly. It's from Jennifer Saravallo's 50 reading strategies text, and we can provide that. I believe that information is included. We can provide that. Awesome strategy that I can model with my students over and over and over again, right? So I probably have an anchor chart somewhere in my room. I might have some exemplars available, but I would introduce this to my students and say, good readers have conversations in their mind as they read back and forth. Your thoughts, your questions, those matter in a text, right? As you're reading, and those help you deepen your understanding, and they also support us when it's time to write about those texts.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's just say, for example, that left-hand side from the text, I want my students to simply lift the claims from a text, right? So we're going to look at a short piece, maybe in our opening. I'm going to do a little modeling with this. I'm going to jot down what I'm thinking, I'm reacting, maybe I have questions. But the goal is that during my modeling, I'm going to identify the claim. I'm going to be able to say that to students based on my modeling, hoping that when I release them to do the same on a piece that they have on their own independently at their grade level, that they can do the same with the strategy.
Right.
Another thing that we can consider is, if you look at this third bullet, is using images and media to engage our students. So I might, to hook my students in, introduce them to media that's going to grab their attention and talk to them about how images are their text as well.
They are hugely important examples to keep in mind. Sorry to interrupt, but I just get so excited about the visual texts. I know that one of the follow-up webinars is going to be about, I think, visual text and visual literacy. So not to be ignored. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help myself. So this is such a good example.
Yeah, so this is a great example. Thinking of teaching thematically, connecting text, hooking our students in, grabbing their attention. I could very well use this in my opening, right? This could either be up when my students walked in, where I simply said, determine the author's point of view. How does the author feel about how technology has impacted our health? Maybe I say to my students, I want you to talk about it first with someone at your table, knowing that as a teacher, they're eventually going to write about this.
Absolutely.
They're going to determine, what's the author's claim here? How do they feel, right? Maybe using this strategy, maybe there's another strategy that you've provided them with, but really hooking them into the lesson. And the mini lesson is a great time for us to do that, plus the modeling piece.
I couldn't agree more. And I love the either elbow partner or in smaller groups of students, the students really talking with one another, sharing ideas on what this, for instance, visual on slide 19, what is this author saying about the business of how technology affects health? So asking students to use evidence from the visual itself can be very cool. And so not to be ignored, those visual texts, they're very powerful.
So the beauty with, as we kind of wrap up this idea of a mini lesson, different ways that we can engage our students is that, as Kevin mentioned, we know what the long-term goal is, right? Thinking that maybe there is an extended writing that's going to be coming up. I want my students, when they get to that point, to have had multiple experiences with this theme of how technology impacts our health. I want them to have experienced various texts. Maybe there are poems that support this theme.
Oh, for sure.
Maybe there are just random quotes from authors that support this theme, but that they've had a variety of experience with this topic in very engaging ways, so that when it's time for that extended response, they have all these resources, all these pieces of evidence to meet the demands of the standard.
I can't agree more.
All right, so I'll let you take this one.
Can we go back just a...
Yeah.
I think we've got the time to do this. Can we go back a few more slides?
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out, actually, go to 17, if you will. I love the visual on the right-hand side. So the what happened, and then on the right-hand side of that chart paper, what it makes me think. Huge. I mean, and the cool thing is as Ashley said, we could take this approach just text at a time. The text could be a nonfiction piece on the role of that technology is having on our broader health. It could be a visual text like the one we saw on slide 19. It could be a high-quality piece of literature where an author, through character development or plot development, is creating a space where his or her characters are thinking through this issue on technology and its effect on health. So a variety of different texts where we're encouraging students to, and we can model this, but then move students into some of that collaborative work session where they are really thinking about what kind of textual evidence am I picking up on what this author seems to be saying about the relationship between technology and its effects on health. And I love what you see on the right-hand side of that chart paper, like that these are some ideas from my own mind, right? So this is an opportunity for me to think or make comments on some of the evidence that I'm seeing this particular author use to develop some claim about the influence of technology on health. So especially when we think about that element of argumentation, of elaboration, where students can elaborate on textual evidence, having a really nice specific space for students, not only, as you see on the left-hand side of this chart paper, to find evidence from the text, whatever that text is, but then on the right-hand side for students working independently or perhaps better in tandem with one another to offer that connection that they are seeing between them. Like, what is this evidence saying to me personally? Do I buy this evidence? Do I find it that, is this a credible source? Things along those lines, because when we tie into the elaboration piece in argumentation, that's really going to be student generated, if that makes sense. So I just really wanted to point that out. And if you go text at a time, there's a great resource that I don't think we included in the PowerPoint, but I'm just going to say it out right now. And a bunch of you on the webinar probably have experienced it before, but there's this great resource. It's really a group called the DBQ Project. And they'll have like an end in mind, kind of like a central question that students could write a longer argument about. Great in language arts and social studies, they provide examples. But what they do is they kind of corral a series of shorter texts, each of which has a specific shorter assignment that is all geared toward that longer piece. So if you haven't checked out the DBQ Project, dbqproject.com, I can't endorse it enough. So, and I think it would tie in very nicely with slides 17 through 19 that Ashley has come up with here. Great stuff here.
All right, we've got a couple questions.
Okay, Joy has a question about particularly slide 14. She said, how long do you anticipate a writing project similar to slide 14, taking in a 60-minute language arts or reading class at the middle school level?
So we've had this conversation.
Yeah.
Kevin and I had this
Yep.
conversation.
Great question, by the way.
It was a great conversation actually, and we talked about the length of a middle school classroom. As a previous middle school teacher, I told him with various student needs, conferencing, just the day of it for a middle school teacher, any teacher, but I feel like it's even crazier in middle school. Our students, it's really going to be based on your students. It's really, I think we both agree that we don't want to just put a time frame on how long an argumentative essay should take a student to complete. I think we both agree that we do need to set some goals for ourselves, and our students need to set some goals. That's a great question. Kevin, what are your thoughts about that? I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the writing process, so that might help.
Yeah, the writing process will be a big help, and I think Joy, it's such a good question. And like every great question, it's hard to come up with an answer to it because it's a question that I think has a lot of complexity to it, and I hope that I'm not sounding non-committal here, but it reminds me a little. It's a great question. It reminds me a little bit of some of the struggle that I have when students ask me, "How long should this response be?" There's no great answer to that question. A lot of it depends on what? It depends on what's my purpose here, who's my audience. These kinds of questions that, as good writers, we just ask ourselves. But for instance, some teachers, they are, I think very rightly, wanting to give their students some authentic experiences for what it might look like and feel like to respond to a longer, in this case, argumentative topic in the confines of what you would see on a summative assessment, where you are, in fact, on the clock.
Right.
Now, that's only one context, right? I could give this topic that you see on slide 14 as a topic that I give students way more time to investigate. And for instance, this one we'll see a little bit later on has 2 passages associated with it, but we just got done talking about how I don't have to limit myself, of course, to 2 passages. I could give my students a variety of different texts. So if I gave students a lot more space and a lot more time to build up toward this particular essay question, I could have a series of class periods designed to really address all of the elements of argumentation that I think my students are going to need to, in turn, succeed on an assignment like this one. If I really do want to give, if I'm thinking as a teacher about giving my students an authentic experience for what it looks like to feel kind of that pull of being on the clock, which I think is a good idea. If you're getting ready to take the SAT and you take the writing component, it's a good idea to put yourself into that situation where you have just X number of minutes to think about the topic, plan, and then draft a response, read what you wrote. You've got a very limited amount of time there. Something very similar would be the case on AP exams. Something very similar would be the case on really any summative kind of assessment. So all that to say, I think it really depends on what our instructional objectives are. If for instance, I wanted to give students an authentic experience of really planning, drafting, and then doing some revisions to an argumentative topic like this one in sort of the context of like more of a summative assessment, I would think that somewhere in the ballpark of 45 minutes to 60 minutes would be reasonable. And I'm just thinking about the amount, and it's going to vary depending on the summative assessment because you've got different time allotments for different summative assessments. But I would hesitate to put a number on it in any kind of global sense because I think it really is, it's a question that, to me, it depends on the context. It depends on the objective as well.
Yeah, and Joy, I learned over time too. My students, the time that they needed varied on how the level of instruction that happened before they got to that extended prompt, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So all the mini lessons, all the tools that they gathered along the way, all the strategies that are now in their toolbox that can support them with an argumentative essay like that, like I reflected on that as a teacher, that the more intentional that I was with building to a task like this, the less time that my students needed. I think something else to think about, Joy, as you plan and have conversations with your colleagues is that our standards are so recursive in English language arts. So the beauty is argumentative is going to come back up over and over and over again. So you have that opportunity there to consider multiple argumentative extended writing experiences. Great question.
Okay, and then Anna ask, how many extended pieces are appropriate for high school students?
Oh, that's such a good question.
That's a great question. You know, that question, immediately what comes to mind for me is the frameworks that the State Department has provided us that gives kind of a suggested amount of pieces, and I can't quote high school specifically, but Anna, that's a great resource that that I would reference. I believe, I feel like it's like 2 to 3 extended pieces per quarter. Definitely check out that. Yeah, with like 4 to 6 shorter pieces. I mean, they're very, there are some ranges that are provided to us from the State Department, so check that out. But again, just thinking of how recursive our standards are, and that this very integrated, balanced literacy approach where we consider, you know, all of the literacy domains, we have many opportunities in our English classrooms and ELA classrooms to address writing and to build that culture of writing.
Absolutely.
I just want to, before we move on, Leela Barber tweeted out in regards to the mini lesson that it should be organic, that teachers have to show their metacognition during writing in front of students. It's so important.
Yes.
Couldn't agree more with that, Leela. Couldn't agree more.
In fact, along those lines of metacognition, let's move into the writer's process now, where this is one visual that you see here on slide 21 with regard to the writer's process. It's certainly not the only visual that you could use. I like this one because it ties in peer editing as a possibility in a variety of stages in the writer's process. If your students are like my students, giving them a concentrated lesson on what it looks like to plan appropriately. I hope I'm not speaking on a turn here, but in my own teaching, I have really slowed down, and I've even had an entire class period related to the planning aspect. It's really important, and if I could even tie in some peer editing potentially to getting back to that idea of, if I start off showing some metacognitive strategies for planning and then have students move into a conversation about planning for a particular assignment, and then there's that work session where students are collaborating on planning, what does it look like to put a good plan together for this particular assignment, given the purpose, given who my audience is, so on and so forth. But then carving out a little bit of time, even within that work session, for students to swap plans and just evaluate. That ties back into the modeling and really the modeling of the metacognition that we did at the beginning of the period. I think that we probably all have seen essays or even shorter kinds of writing activities where it was evident to us as teachers that students didn't first slow down and plan. Sometimes it looks like students not even really answering the question. Sometimes it looks like them kind of answering the question, but for instance, maybe they're not including textual evidence from the number of sources that we're asking. So I like to really, in that planning aspect, really encourage students to slow down, and we can model what it looks like for students to slow down before they plan. If I introduce peer editing, I can have students in my class offer a little bit of feedback on the planning that their partner has done, which I think is a great idea. And then I can move into drafting. I might have several drafts if it's a longer kind of assignment where I'm giving students multiple days to work through, for instance, an argumentative assignment. And then at some point I'm going to have to turn it in, right? At some point my final copy is going to have to go before the intended audience. So we're going to talk mainly about two aspects of the writer's process today, namely the planning piece, and then secondly, peer editing. So let's move on. Oh, quick question for you here. This ties back into that instructional framework that we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar. A question for you, and you could tweet out an answer to this using the hashtag culture of writing, or you could use the chat feature on in the webinar. About how much class time do you tend to dedicate to each phase of the writer's process? And this would be for longer argumentative assignments. Namely, if you were having students craft arguments over multiple days. So multiple days to plan, gather evidence, draft, engage in peer editing, do revisions, and then finally turn things in. no one right answer to this question. This is simply a survey kind of question. We're just interested in practitioners in the field about how much class time do you dedicate to each phase of the writer's process. So we'll give you a few minutes to respond to that. Some of you might be thinking that the answer to this question really does depend on the assignment, and I think that would be a really, really good answer. Yeah. So if it's a shorter argumentative assignment, for instance, I might dedicate way less time to each aspect of the writer's process versus if it were a longer assignment. Well, this one has the parentheses for longer argumentative assignments. So there's no one right answer to these questions, to this question, but I think it's a good one for us to think about. Getting back to this slide here on 21, and I really like what Ashley said about evidence. So if we're, for instance, if I'm a teacher and I haven't given my students a lot of exposure to what it might look like to effectively plan, for instance, to an argumentative assignment, and I see that borne out in their essays, I think that's really good data for me that I can take back and think about, do I need to revise my thinking about how much time should I dedicate to the planning aspect of a longer argumentative piece. So for instance, there is an example, one example of a longer argumentative piece. Question, should I say? Thank you. We'll look at a piece or an actual student response in just a second. Oh, we have a question now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, what reflective questions would you suggest for teachers in determining time frames for mini versus regular lessons, the number of classes for writing assignments, etc.? What things should they be asking themselves?
Oh yeah, good question. You want to go?
That's great.
Yeah.
I think Kevin just mentioned a little of that. You know, what mini lessons have I already taught?
Yep.
Like what mini lessons do I know they've experienced? Maybe what am I noticing as I conduct those desk side conferences, or you know, I've seen teachers have systems where peer editors or the students provide their classmates' feedback. Like, what does that information say? Definitely the length of the whatever the text dependent question or prompt is. If you're on the side of not necessarily that authentic writing, but you're looking at a specific text dependent question. And maybe within your questions, a nice place to start is breaking down your prompt and looking at the standards and how they match, and saying, okay, have we addressed the standard? Have I taught this? How are my students progressing with the standard? And how does that support the question that's being asked? I feel like that was kind of all over, but
no, I think they're good
questions
answers
to ask yourself. I'm going to keep thinking about that as we go forward, and maybe we can circle back around to that too. If something else comes up, we can share that with you.
And we can continue this conversation beyond the confines of this webinar,
yes,
because it's a really good question.
Please, yeah, and I like that you said reflective questions that we can be asking ourselves. Great question.
Yeah, and just reiterate, like one of the reflective questions that I ask myself when I'm working with students all the time is, I'm just constantly getting information from my students on how are they doing and what adjustments do I need to make based on data points that I'm seeing in terms of student work, in terms of the conversations that they're having, so on and so forth. So that can generate a lot of reflective questions in my own mind about different aspects, for instance, of the writer's process that I might need to spend more or less time on.
Right.
So what's this prompt asking? It's a good place to start, isn't it? I mean, so I've got to weigh the claims on both sides. And then write an argumentative essay, and it's asking me to take a position, in your own words, supporting one side of the debate. Okay? And then using evidence from both texts in your argumentative essay. Good thing to keep in mind. Here are the reading passages. I included them just for your reference. We're not going to spend time going through the reading passages, but we've got a couple of reading passages associated with this prompt. This is the prompt that we saw in our September session. Getting into the plan, I want to be clear that this is not the only way that students could plan for an argumentative essay. However, I have seen a lot of students use something like a T-chart pretty effectively, especially in a context where they're on the clock. Now, I want to be clear as well that I think that a T-chart could work really nicely even if you had more time to work through an essay. In other words, you weren't on a clock of 45 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever the case might be. You've got more time to breathe, more space to kind of work through this particular assignment. I still think that this is an example, not the example, but an example of something that can really help you read more effectively, gather evidence more effectively, and then I think you can use a T-chart or a Venn diagram. That's also a really good spot or a really good tool that can also help you when it comes to actually composing the essay. So I like how, what I've done here is, this is an example student's T-chart that I happen to really like. So this is something, getting back to somebody's point about metacognition. Like, if I'm helping students put a T-chart together, I don't want to take for granted the idea that some students might not know how to work a T-chart, or they might not know how to work a Venn diagram. And so this is where I can come in and get a lot of conversation going with students about this approach. So what I have really at the horizontal of the T is really nothing more than the prompt, right? Technology. I paraphrased it a little bit, but does it lead to health problems, or does it help people stay healthy? That's really the question that I need to consider. And when I go to either side of the T-chart, I'm going to have one position on one side and then the other position on the other side. It can be very helpful for me as I'm gathering evidence. Now, in this particular assignment, I have 2 reading passages. But if you get into something like an AP language exam, you've got a bunch of documents that you need to consider. But the cool thing is that the nature of the assignment on one of the writing questions, I have one in mind from the 2015 exam that's in the public domain that has to do with, should universities have an honor code? Well, I could, if I did a T-chart for that question at the very top of the T, I could have that be the question: should universities have an honor code? And in the left-hand side of my T-chart, like the pro position, on the right-hand side of my T-chart, the con position. And now I've got 6 or 7 or 8 sources or documents that I need to consider, some of which are going to be leveraging the pro position, some the con position. So this is a planning strategy that can work really nicely in a lot of different contexts. So just a couple more minutes, a couple more comments on what this student is doing. Notice that the student, as he or she read the 2 passages, didn't just get details, textual details, or evidence, if you will, that aligns with this technology leads to health problems or that it helps people stay fit. Notice, too, that the student also incorporated broad reasons. That's a great vocabulary term for argumentation. So as I am getting back to metacognition, I can encourage students not only to include textual details for either of these positions, but what are the big, broad reasons that these authors seem to be bringing forward to support either the leads to health problems position or that it helps people stay fit position. So one of the reasons would be it leads to health problems. How do we know this? Well, physical activity is down. Let me go back to one of the reading passages. If you go to, what slide is this? This is slide 24. This is really, it's really getting into the second paragraph, right? So if I read the second paragraph, I can even model this for students or have students think it through, but in the second paragraph, what seems to be the big reason that this author thinks that technology actually is leading to health problems? Well, one reason, at least what we see in the second paragraph, is that physical activity is down because of technology. Okay, fair enough. Way to identify one key reason. What would be some textual details or evidence that this writer gives to support that reason? Here the student actually brought in some examples of evidence that shows that physical activity is down. I really like this more structured approach to the T-chart, especially if I work with my students on what it looks like to put it together, because not only does it nicely guide the reading and help students think through what are the key reasons, but also the details that writers are using to support their claims, getting back to some of the reading and the writing standards, but also it can really help me when I turn around and need to write my essay. Because I weigh the evidence on either side, and then what I do is I pick one side. If I go reason but then also details, I've really got a pretty nice structure for some of my body paragraphs, if that makes sense. Reason could be a topic sentence that fits in somewhere within one of my body paragraphs, and then I'll have details that support that particular reason. So I really like how the essay is kind of mapped out for you already. If you take this structured approach to a T-chart, I think you could take a very structured approach like this to a Venn diagram as well.
Yes.
Do you want to chip in on that?
No, I agree. Looking at this T-chart too also reminds me of that first strategy that we talked about, the reading across the text. We know that providing students with tools to help them organize their thoughts and to plan is essential to supporting them with their writing. So I couldn't agree more.
The other cool thing, if you for 7th grade students and higher, if you get an argumentative assignment, at least on summative assessments, you know that there is going to be an expectation that students address a counterclaim.
Absolutely.
And so
that's difficult.
It is difficult. And so the cool thing about like a T-chart or a Venn diagram is it allows me to bring in evidence from multiple positions. And even if I go with the position that it leads to health problems, I also have some evidence for the other side, how it actually helps people stay fit, and I'm going to be able to access that evidence when I address my counterclaim. So I hope that this structured T-chart makes sense to everyone. I have seen a lot of students use it pretty effectively. I've worked with students on putting it together. And I've even spent an entire class period on the nuts and bolts of putting together a more structured T-chart, to help guide the reading, but then also this can really help you map out your essay on the back end. So if you want to talk about that further, please just get in touch with us. Okay?
Yes, and if I could just mention, Emmanuel Reddish, he tweeted to us a question. He asked, how do you motivate your apathetic writers, you know, the students who struggle from the start?
Yes, good question.
You know, tools like this, right? So the modeling piece, Emmanuel, I'm not sure if you were on with us when we started. We talked about some very specific norms and the role of the instructional framework and how we hook our students in. So please continue this conversation, Emmanuel, but I would say, just as a previous middle school teacher, definitely those graphic organizers, those writing tools that support them to be independent writers, and probably I would say my next after the learning tools would be the very intentional conferencing that happens with those students. Of course, when relationships and rapport is established, everything else flourishes, but specific to instructional wise, definitely those learning tools and conferencing for me.
Great answer. And if I could also throw in the answer of like thinking through assignments and texts that are intrinsically interesting and motivating to our students. I think that is not the golden answer, if you will, but it can address some motivation issues. In fact, I as a student, I see value in this. Like, this topic matters to me. This subject matters to me. So, of course, that can correlate with higher motivation. But really good question.
Great question. There's several other questions too, and we'll address those in a couple of moments.
When you move into drafting, good rhythm to get students into, keep your plan out.
Right.
You did a great job if you did a T-chart, for instance, here, or if you came up with a Venn diagram or some other kind of approach to just map out your thinking. Keep that out as you draft and then get going. And then, I don't know if your students are like many students with whom I've worked, but this last piece of like reading what you wrote can be a tough rhythm to get students into. So that's why like the author's chair or sharing out at the end of a particular class period can be a really specific way to help students do that last step of read what you wrote.
I agree. I had the opportunity to observe a teacher a couple weeks ago, and she uses the routine of clock buddies, which are just random ways of pairing the students. I've also seen examples of what are referred to as literacy partners, but really I think putting in place some very unique ways to get the students collaborating and getting them to reread their pieces to reflect on and make any additions. So get a little creative with that.
Indeed. And another specific example of having students read what they wrote is actually to turn it over to peer editing, which we know from research can be a really, really effective practice, especially if we give some very specific things for our peer editors to look for.
Right.
I never liked peer editing in classes where I just got the instruction of just read your partner's paper.
Right.
Okay, I'm 16, like or if I'm in middle school,
Yeah,
I'm 13, and it's like I liked your paper a lot, or you misspelled a few words. You see what I'm saying? I mean, I think we've got a great opportunity to really think about peer editing in more specific ways. So for instance, if I can model, and we talked about this a little bit back in the September session, but if we can get students comfortable, and some of the color coding or just the coding that you see here on slide 28 can be one way, not the way, but one way to help our students take ownership of the vocabulary of, in this case, argumentation.
Absolutely.
So as I work on, this could even be something that I work on in a mini lesson, one element at a time. Like, think about claim, and let's look at a short argument, and as a group, let's identify the author's claim here. Same thing with reasons, textual evidence, elaboration, counterclaim. I could do a mini lesson on any of those elements of argumentation to increasingly help my students develop confidence and knowledge about what these terms mean. What are these elements, right? If we like the idea of coding, claim, reasons, textual evidence, elaboration, counterclaim, so on and so forth, I could have my students in a peer editing context really code their partner's argumentative essay using that routine. So for instance, we saw this last time. I had the wrong essay in our last session. Again, many apologies for that. This is the correct essay. This is the actual 9th grade essay. And so what we've done here is in terms of what we just were talking about, like we identified the author's claim by putting it in bold. We identified a key reason at the bottom of paragraph 2 by highlighting that in blue. Textual evidence is in green. Keep going here. Next paragraph, same thing. I've got another reason in the second body paragraph, which is in blue, some textual evidence to support that reason, and then finally further elaboration on that textual evidence. That is really nice. The student at the very last paragraph on this slide is really addressing a counterclaim. So the peer editor here put that in italics. And so at the end of it all, what we have here is, as a peer editor, this is a really hands-on way for me to evaluate my partner's paper for, did you include some of the elements of effective argumentation in your response? And the cool thing is that those elements of argumentation are going to apply essentially any time a student sits down to write an argument. So peer editing can take on a whole new meaning if we get really specific with vocabulary and taking on some of the elements of, in this case, argumentation. And these are some of the specific look-fors that we have our students do in a peer editing context. And quickly here, but you know, we can move a little bit more quickly since we've kind of set the elements already. Something would be really similar for narrative writing, and we'll just skip this question for sake of time. But let's say we saw this topic the last time we met in September. This was a cool classroom example that a group of American Lit teachers came up with, and I said, do you mind if I share this out? And they said, no, absolutely. The advantage here is that they had been reading Great Gatsby with their students, and so they had local knowledge of their students' engagement with this particular text. So we saw this last time. The prompt was rewrite a particular scene, not from the point of view in question, which was Nick Carraway's point of view, but instead write this scene from Gatsby's point of view. So we have this scene again, and what's important to note about this scene is that Gatsby is so stressed out. Like, he's so anxious about seeing Daisy again for the first time. So it's important for the student to answer that prompt successfully, not only to have some ideas on what are the key details in this scene, like what's going on in this scene, but also what do I know about Gatsby and Nick? How are they feeling during this scene? These are kinds of things that I should keep in mind as I recreate the scene. Talk a little bit earlier about using that instructional framework. I can have students just ask themselves this question, even in smaller groups, as they plan out a response. So what are some of the key things that happen in this scene? Well, I could ask that of a broader group of students, but I could also have students answer that question in smaller groups or even in a partner-up kind of context. That piece about how is Gatsby feeling, how is Nick feeling in this scene, such a good question in order to really do a nice job responding to that prompt. So nice things to keep in mind during planning. And then, of course, as you get going on your draft, and when you finish, you read what you wrote, I've got some specific look-fors now in terms of peer editing for narratives, such as specific description of things like setting, characters, events, and then any dialogue that my partner might include, I could highlight that in blue. So I could get specific description, I could highlight that in green, or effective dialogue, I could highlight that in blue. A nice question to think about as a peer editor is there a connection between these elements and the reading passage? So the dialogue that you included, does it make sense given, for instance, what you learn in the actual passage? Nice thing to encourage my students to be looking for as well. Oh, so for an example, there we've got the nice specific description highlighted in green, and then, of course, the dialogue that's highlighted in blue. Okay. So just a little bit of, adds a little bit of concreteness, if you will, to peer editing. And quick comment, that color coding, those codes are arbitrary. I mean, they don't have to be green or blue. You can go with whatever color you want, but I have found those to be pretty effective, especially for students who are really visual learners. Comments on that?
No, I think that's great.
Okay, we're winding up now. Just a connection to research. So what we know, and I can't recommend this piece enough. A colleague of mine, a good friend of mine, recommended this piece to me over the summertime, and I haven't thanked him enough for it. The next time I see him, I'm going to thank him again. Great, great, great piece by Graham Harrison Santangelo. We sent the PDF. It's a pretty readable piece. It talks a lot about what we know from research in terms of evidence of particular strategies on students' overall writing achievement. 2 out of several that they highlight in the piece is teaching writing as a process, and then secondly, helping students own the vocabulary of a genre. So both shown to have significant positive effects on students' writing achievement, whether we're talking about argumentation, informational writing, narrative writing. Graham Harrison Santangelo talk about several other specific techniques. These are just 2 that we've highlighted here. Can't recommend that piece enough. You won't be sorry that you read it. Promise.
So we'll jump to our contact. Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so we had a couple of closing reflection statements. We will continue the conversation on Twitter. We would love for you to reach out to us, just as you did after session 1 with questions and requesting resources. It's so exciting for us to know that we are having this conversation across the state and with so many very committed educators. There are several tweets that we're going to continue to address, although our time is ending here with you. We'll continue to respond here. Feel free to continue to post questions using your chat feature on the GoToWebinar system. And we are so pleased that we had another opportunity to be with you. This has been very powerful, very inspiring. Yeah.
Can't agree more. Yeah. Thanks for making the time to talk about this and for engaging in this discussion. Ashley, I'm interested to hear your closing remark along the lines of reading instruction and writing instruction. I think it's challenging work, right? And so just like we know, like people develop as writers in community, a kind of a co-creation of really good reading and writing strategies and really knowledge, period. I think that really the same applies to us as practitioners.
Absolutely.
I mean, an opportunity to talk very genuinely and specifically about things that we're doing that really seem to be working well, or things that we need to revise.
Absolutely.
So let's keep the conversation going.
Please, let's.
And we do recognize that there are a few questions that some of our participants have posed, and we will pass those on to our presenters who will in turn answer your questions. But next we have our colleague from our special ed department, Ms. Dee Dee Bunn, who's going to come and share some information as it relates to the Universal Design for Learning.
Good morning. This was a great webinar. Every time I sit in and listen to everyone, I've learned so much. My purpose today is to really bring this back around to how we can use Universal Design for Learning to integrate that into our instruction. And remember that that is a planning process where at the beginning you design your instruction to support all your students in the classroom, not only your struggling students, but also your students that may need enhancement. One of the things that they talked about throughout, and they always talk about when we're talking about writing, is the need to model. And modeling is an amazing strategy to use when you're looking at supporting the variety of learners in your classrooms, because you can do different types of modeling for your different students as far as what their needs are. The instructional framework that was presented, I think, is a really good guide to use when you're designing your instruction, especially when you're remembering the time frames that'll vary. Some of your students may need more time, other students may not need as much time. The transition time, I thought, was a great time to look at how you can motivate and engage your students and build in choice. When some of the things that you put down as far as the things that could be done during that transition time, I thought were very good ways to bring in the choice there. During the work session, you might think about some potential challenges or barriers that some of your students may experience and build in the strategies during that work session to support those students. I also liked the way that they talk about the mini lessons. That's a good way to look at different ways or methods that you can support that element of different ways to represent your content and different ways that you can represent the materials that you have the students using. You can do that by varying the levels of language that you're doing with the students, the language not only that you're using with the students, but also the language that you are expecting back to them in their written product. But both language in the ways of supporting, but also enhancing. Let's say you have students that you want to enhance and get them to expand their writing. What kinds of language are you looking at for them? The elements in the standards, I love the slides where you listed out all the different elements within a standard. That's a great guide for looking at how you might want to do a variety of different ways to represent the things that you are trying to teach them. I thought that would be a very, very good tool for you, looking at the ways that you organize the writing, different ways that kids can actually act out on the written product, and different ways of language levels that you can use for them. The example, I love the examples of images. As soon as I saw the cartoon image, I was like, oh, that's perfect. That is so good. That is visual text, and that's something that all students can take away something from, whether they're readers or non-readers, whether they're children that have English as a second language. That's a great way to help supplement and support those students in their text. The T-charts that you guys talked about were great. What does the text say and what do you pull from that? And then when you went further and expanded on that as ways for kids to plan. That's great. And keeping it out there I thought was just wonderful, because I have so many kids that when you go to write, once they get past the planning session, if they don't have it out there, they completely forget what they were trying to write about. So that was also very good. The color coding, and I think we talked about the color coding the last time that we met. I think is a great way for not only the students that are having peer editing done on their work to see that they have all the elements that they need, but as you said, for the editors themselves, being able to see what are they supposed to be editing for. So it becomes a meaningful process. The last thing I wanted to talk about was when you talked about using reflective questions for yourself. And I really like that idea when we're planning instruction, is to sit down and talk about reflective questions of what are the students doing right now? What are my students doing? And what do I need to do to change my instruction so that it will better support all of the students in my classroom? So UDL is just remembering that there are a variety of different ways that we can engage and motivate our students, different ways we can support and represent the materials that we're trying to teach them, and then different ways that they can act on those materials or they can express the knowledge that they have learned from you. So thank you for another great webinar.
And we do have a few minutes, so we're going to pose a few of our questions from our audience. And one is, are there specific sites or resources that you would recommend or suggest for effective writing process graphic organizers?
Yeah, I can't think of any sites right offhand. I feel like I've seen such a great collection, just kind of teacher created on the spot. I'm very authentic, sometimes even student created based on a student's learning style and their preference for organizing.
Right.
I do think, as Kevin mentioned, maybe within your PLCs, begin to share, like what rubrics do you have, what tools are you using? I can't think of a site offhand.
Off the top of my head,
yeah.
But I will parking lot that one and be thinking about that one.
There are a couple of sites that I have used with some of my students. I will say, before I start giving out names of sites, anytime you go to a site and look at it, be sure that you are looking that it will meet the needs of the students that you have.
Sure.
One site that I like a lot, and it's actually done through Google Chrome, is a site called MindMup, M-U-P. It's an interesting name, but one of the things I like about that is it has a webbing component in it so that you can build out and plan, but it also takes that material and converts it into an outline format that students can then download and use as a basis for their initial draft.
And then we have another question. Any suggestions for planning for perspective change in narrative writing? That they're explaining that they don't have strategies or graphic organizers to assist the students, those who are kind of unimaginative and they're not good at seeing someone else's perspective?
That's a great question. And that's a tough one. I was sharing with Kevin, I'm supporting some teachers tomorrow with that very element and skill. In our first session, we shared an exemplar from the middle school EOG, and we said that would be a great kind of cold read to share with your students and then model through that, like using that exemplar and using the student exemplar, since there is an actual response there, to maybe like introduce your students to what an effective response looks like, and then kind of go backwards and talk about how do you get there. The teaching channel has a video that is titled, I believe it's titled Writing to Learn or Writing to Describe, and there's a teacher there that uses a strategy that gets her students thinking outside of the box. Maybe reference that video resource. Another great strategy is using images. I had the opportunity to see an elementary teacher in Cobb County who opens each of her lessons with an image, and the students just write. And I think the next step to that could be to have them maybe swap and then analyze each other's perspectives and have conversations about, how I might see things differently than you. That might be a nice strategy to get students thinking from a different point of view. That's an awesome question, and I know I would love to continue to have conversations about strategies that you and your team build or choose to use to address that.
Acting out as well.
Yeah.
And you don't have to let it go on forever, but like a quick scene, right? Especially if the energy in your classroom is a little bit on the downside, like if you're teaching high school seniors and they haven't had coffee yet, I mean, it can be a great piggyback off of what do we learn about Gatsby and Nick in this scene, for instance, and it's really a matter of a few students just acting out. That's a great question. I've always liked that one and have talked with a lot of teachers who resort to that one when they're thinking about perspective, when they're thinking about point of view. So I think that can be a really fun one as well.
Yeah, and I love the question that's so specific to narrative. I think the beautiful thing about our standards, our Georgia Standards of Excellence, and the way that they're written is that they're so recursive, and so that we have opportunities over and over and over to address the various genres of writing in very brief manners or extended, and so that's an opportunity itself. To ensure that your students have those opportunities over and over in various writing experiences.
Sure.
Yeah. We had a couple. I just want to give a shout out to Emmanuel Reddish from Carrollton County, and then Regina from Douglas County. You all have just been tweeting away this this session, and we love it. Leila Barber from Cobb County. That's actually my teammate. She's an outstanding. Thank you for joining us this morning. A couple other questions. We see some questions about time again, and I think we addressed that in various ways throughout this session, and just really thinking back to, the standards, the goal, what do the mini lessons look like in your class, the modeling, the language component. So I think we agree that we don't have an answer to time. If you saw that document, that instructional framework, it's just suggested, and those instructional time frames really vary based on the context. So definitely recognize that many of us have questions about time and what that needs to look like. But I think just keeping in mind all of our literacy domains and really planning in a very integrated manner supports us with the time piece sometimes.
That's right. That's right.
Any other questions? All right, so we will continue the conversation here on Twitter. Again, it has been an absolute pleasure to be with you.
It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you, partner.
Yes, it's been great. Have a great day. Continue to do great things for students.
Indeed.
So we thank you for joining us for the second session, Essential Components of Writing. We also want to thank our presenters who have given their time and knowledge to this project. As you prepare to leave us, remember that the follow-up professional learning has a twofold purpose. Excuse me. One, to guide implementation back in your respective classrooms, and two, to provide consistent implementation across the state. Be sure to complete the survey presenters that I will be sending out this afternoon to our facilitators. I apologize. You'll also find the recording of this session. We look forward to seeing you on Twitter. Don't forget to use the hashtag Culture of Writing, and stay tuned for next month's 6/12 session entitled Writing Genres. Thank you, and create an amazing day.